So welcome everyone to tonight's presentation from the MAREA group. MAREA is the Mid-Atlantic Renewable Energy Association. We provide educational and informative presentations on renewable energy and sustainable living. Tonight we have backyard composting coming in July. We have a scientist from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory who will be talking about integrating renewables into the grid. We all see the solar farms going up and the solar panels going on roofs and windmills being installed here and there, but the thing that's not talked about a lot is how hard it is to get all that to where it's needed, get that power to where it's needed, and for the utilities to actually integrate that power into their grids so they function properly. So it'll be a very interesting discussion about a very important topic, and that's in July. And then in August, we're going to hear from electric vehicle owners who are going to talk about their experiences driving, charging, putting in solar in their homes to charge from home. And along with that, if anyone in the audience has some interesting experiences with electric vehicles that they think they would like to share with the group, please send us an email at, give that to you in a second, hello@themarea.org. And you can also find that on our website. And then finally, before we start, I just want to point out that we get some great speakers. We're now, because we are on Zoom, we're getting speakers from all over the country. We're getting great people like tonight's speaker, Doug Reigle, who's an expert in his field. And we'd really like to see our audience grow. So I would encourage everybody who's on this presentation to follow us on Facebook. I thought I'd never say that. And then share our emails and our meeting notices with your friends and family and whoever you think might have an interest. And with that, Phil, you want to introduce tonight's speaker?
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, now it's time for backyard composting. We are pleased to have tonight Doug Reigle, who's a Master Gardener class of 2015. Master Gardeners support Penn State Extension's educational programs in consumer horticulture and develop horticultural expertise through participation in education training classes conducted by Penn State University faculty and extension staff. Doug had a farming childhood and has a lifelong passion for gardening. Welcome.
Good evening. I'm looking forward to making the presentation. Everyone will be able to get a little something out of it. The title is Easy Backyard Composting, and we hope to make it easy for everyone. Nature's Recycler. So I apologize for this first slide because I had to switch from a PC to a Chromebook, and so it gets turned on its side.
I'll just turn on our sides now.
Perfect. If you've ever taken a walk in the woods, you may wonder why a walk in the woods would be appropriate for composting, but if you've ever taken that walk in the woods, you get that nice earthy smell while you're walking through the woods. And that is indeed nature doing its own composting. If you've ever wondered what happens to all the leaves and such, nature takes care of that, and that's the composting. And for anyone who's interested, that's off of McAfee's Knob along the Appalachian Trail in Virginia. So normally I make this presentation live and in person, and we actually are able to get immediate feedback. But in this particular case, I'll just assume that I can cover all experience levels in composting. So composting is recycling naturally. Again, we're all familiar with taking our plastics and our metals and recycling them in an effort to be more environmentally aware. Similarly, if you compost, you're really recycling waste products that could otherwise end up in a landfill, and we really want to avoid that. Plus, you get the ultimate benefit of the end product of compost. So what is composting? Again, it's using that natural decay process that happens all the time, and we're going to change all types of organic materials into a valuable humus-like material. So we can talk about grass clippings, food scraps, leaves. All of them ultimately will merge together and give you that finished product, the compost. Now, composting truly is easy, but you want to know what you might need for that successful composting. Again, if we were presenting this in person, we'd have a show of hands on what you would actually need. If you looked at the first answer, leaves, grasses, and garden scraps, well, that was the previous slide. So obviously those are all good things, but that's not necessarily the precise answer. You could look at answer number 2, organic matter with a little lime and wood ash. Certainly organic matter is needed. Lime and wood ash, you can get away with it, but we'll go into that in a little more detail later on why that's not necessarily the best. And finally, answer number 3, organic matter, microbes, water, air, and warmth. That's the ideal answer. That's what you really want to have working to make your waste into compost. Answer number 4, all the above plus some animal protein to keep it cooking. Actually, animal protein will break down just fine in a compost pile, but we don't recommend that you use any animal protein because it presents its own problems with attracting nuisance animals and such. So composting is just speeding up the natural decay process. And I like to say that I've been composting for the better part of 60 plus years, because this was the first task that my mother ever thought I was responsible enough to actually do. And that was to take the kitchen scraps from the kitchen around the back of the house where we had a compost pile, dump the scraps, come back, and not get too terribly distracted in the process. So I was probably composting since the age of about 3 or 4. But again, the composting, we talked about how it occurs naturally in the woods and the forest, but that can take a long period of time. So if you're going to do composting at home, you don't want to wait a year or more for those materials to break down, particularly if you're as impatient as I am. You want things to go much quicker. And in doing a compost pile, you actually get to control all the elements that will affect the speed of composting. You get to control the materials going in, the food, you get to control the oxygen or air and the water and the temperature. So by maximizing each of those materials or elements, you end up with a much faster process. So what do we actually need to make compost? The first thing you need is decomposers, things that will actually do the work for you. And these are mainly bacteria and fungus or fungi. And they do all the work for you. Well, most of the work for you. And you don't even have to look too far for them. They will come to you. You also need the food for the decomposers because they're not going to work for free. They want to be fed. And so you're going to use your organic waste materials that you intend to compost. That's going to be the food. And you want that perfect compost environment. You want to make sure that you retain the right amount of air, water, and warmth throughout the process. So where do the decomposers come from? Again, bacteria and fungus are already on everything just about. So if you build a compost pile, the decomposers are going to be there. They're going to be in the soil. They're going to be on the leaves and food scraps. They're going to be, if you add any previously finished compost, it'll be in that. And each of these microorganisms will contribute to the decomposition of your waste material. As far as what is the best food for your decomposers, basically anything that is organic will compost. In fact, I was just reading an article not that long ago about a company out in the state of Washington that will take human remains and compost them and give back nice compost to the loved ones remaining. But you definitely don't want to be composting anything like that in your backyard. So what should you put in? You should put in things like garden trimmings, grass clippings, kitchen scraps, leaves. If you happen to be lucky enough to have access to things like cow manure, chicken manure, that's great. If you have ready access to sawdust or you shred a lot of paper, emphasize the shredded paper. You don't want to put in whole sheets of paper. That's not a great solution or a great material. You want it to be shredded. Those are all good things. But you want to also avoid some things going into your compost pile. Fats, grease, meat and dairy products. And I have a confession to make. It says don't put unwashed eggshells in your compost pile because they can attract pests and vermin. Personally, I don't waste the water to wash the eggshells. I crush them, let them dry out, and then when I put them into the compost pile, I dig them in so they're not right on the surface, so they don't represent an attractive nuisance. You also don't want to put in any hard to kill weeds like bindweed or quackgrass, or one that we're currently experiencing at one of our demonstration gardens for master gardeners, wireweed. It just does not want to break down in the compost pile. You also should be considerate of weeds that have gone to seed. If you are able to maintain a high enough temperature in your compost pile, those weed seeds should be broken down, but you have to weigh the cost-benefit analysis of maybe not having enough temperature control on the compost pile, which may mean that some of your weed seeds may not be destroyed, and then when you use the compost, they'll reemerge. You also don't want to use cat or dog waste. If you've got a guinea pig or a rabbit, that's fine, but the dogs and cats tend to have the chance of having bacteria and parasites that can cause problems. There was a recent study done where under controlled circumstance, they were able to destroy all the parasites and bacteria in dog waste. But again, we certainly would not recommend that you do that. It's just too risky that you could ultimately present those parasites and pests into your gardens. And even in the controlled condition and study, they recommended only using it if you were going to do it for ornamental gardens. Similarly, you don't want to put diseased or insect-ridden plants into the compost. It would be possible for those insects to multiply in your compost pile and then ultimately reemerge when you use the compost. Some of the diseased plants, the disease will not be destroyed by the temperature, excuse me, of the compost. And similarly, that could be a problem. So those are things you want to avoid into your compost pile. Similarly, I mentioned earlier that lime can be used in moderation, but the more lime you put in, the higher the pH of your compost pile. And the higher the pH is, the more likely you're going to end up releasing ammonia. Two things that are bad with that. The first is that it smells like ammonia. The second problem that you have with that is when your compost pile is emitting ammonia, it means that that's losing nitrogen. Nitrogen is a beneficial nutrient that you really want to get out of your compost. So again, you avoid increasing the pH to get the maximum value out of your compost. Same idea with wood ash. I know a lot of people like to have a fireplace going or use wood for their main heat supply. You can use sparing amounts of wood ash into your compost pile, but if you're generating a lot of wood ash, same thing, it's going to increase the pH. You're going to have that ammonia odor and you're going to lose the valuable nitrogen. So do you have to shred the particles that go into your compost pile? Many of you may have received the same admonishment that I got from my mom: chew your food at least 30 times. Well, same thing for the decomposers that are going to be working in your compost pile. The smaller the particle, the easier it is for them to digest and to use the food. Doesn't mean that you have to shred, but it certainly makes the composting process go a little bit faster. So if you're adding grass clippings, you're already kind of shredding when you're doing that. And we'll touch on leaves a little bit later in the presentation. But if you're putting in just large plants that you've pulled out, you definitely might want to chop them up a little bit. The same way that we try to eat a balanced diet ourselves, our decomposers in our they like to have a nice mixture of carbon-rich and nitrogen-rich materials. Carbon-rich materials are the organic wastes that are commonly referred to in composting as browns. Anything that's nitrogen-rich we'll refer to as greens. They don't always look brown and they don't always look green, but that's what we'll refer to them as. The browns, that would include materials such as leaves, straw, the shredded paper, if you have access to sawdust, the bedding from your cows, your horses. Once it's mixed with manure, it's a little bit of both brown and green because the manure itself would be a green. And here's the green, the high nitrogen material, your vegetable scraps. And here's one that clearly is going to look brown, coffee grounds. It obviously looks brown, but it has a very high nitrogen content. And you can actually go online and search for nitrogen content of certain materials, and you can find that. It's amazing the number of sites will give you detailed information on nitrogen and carbon content of waste products. Grass clippings, again, that falls into the green category, and manure from cow, horse, and poultry. I will give you a little caution on the poultry. poultry manure does tend to increase the pH of the compost pile. So just as with the lime and the ash, it can cause you to emit ammonia odor. So you want to do that in somewhat limited fashion as well. So when you're doing this composting mixture, you want an ideal ratio of 3 parts brown to 1 part green by volume. And if anyone out there is actually able to achieve that on a regular basis, I salute you, because I don't think I've ever actually managed to get that perfect ratio going, because you never get the browns and greens to that ratio when you're actually in the process of composting, but try to get as close as possible. We talk about composting as aerobic composting. We want aerobic bacteria and microbes to be in your compost pile. We don't want anaerobic bacteria, because they're the bacteria that causes the rotten egg odors. So we want to make sure that we get those that use oxygen. There's a whole list of different bacteria that will react at different temperatures, but the best way to make the compost in a speedy fashion is to take advantage of the aerobic composters. When you use aerobic composting, you should get absolutely no offensive odors. Any odor that you get should be that earthy smell, and I don't think anyone really finds that to be terribly offensive. And those aerobic decomposers are going to produce a lot of heat while they're eating. Many of you maybe have done aerobic exercising. Think of that when you're using up all that oxygen, you're creating a lot of heat as well. So you can figure out whether your compost pile is working really well, whether those bacteria and microbes are doing their job. If you happen to have a soil thermometer, shove that into the compost pile. And if it's above 120 or in the range of 120 to 160 degrees, it means you've got a perfect compost pile going. At a lower temperature, it's still working, so that's a good thing, but it's not going to break down quite as quickly. So does a compost pile actually have to get hot? And the answer to that is no, but I've already said I'm sort of an impatient person, so if my compost pile is not getting hot, it's going to take a much longer time to break down. So you don't want to wait for that slower decay, and there are ways to control it. Having said that, I will tell you that at the Ag Center, where we have a demonstration garden for composting, we do or have had static composting, where we just put a pile of waste into a container and watch it decompose. And it will, but it takes about a year. So if your compost pile isn't getting hot, there are a few things to look for: making sure it's getting enough air, consider that it might not have enough or too much water, and again, that ratio of browns to greens may be off by a little bit. So that high temperature will provide the most rapid composting, and maybe more importantly, it will be more likely to kill any disease-causing organisms that may have gotten into your compost pile, and it may kill the weed seeds more effectively. Now, anyone who has ever had a compost pile, if you've ever put tomato or squash seeds into your compost pile, I can almost guarantee you at some point in time, you've sprouted tomato plants and squash plants, because for whatever reason, as good as I think that I've been composting, I just don't seem to always be able to kill all the tomato and squash seeds. Pile aeration, you want to make sure that you're getting that oxygen into the pile. If the pile becomes compacted, and it will as it breaks down, that's just a natural part of the process, that the volume will decrease as the decomposers are doing their job, and the porosity will go away as the spaces are filled. So the browns help maintain good porosity, but if you get that compacted pile as it's decomposing, you want to turn the pile to get air in and get greater porosity. So here we have a photo of someone actually turning their compost pile. It is getting the air in, and you also can see the example of turning tools can make it easier to do the job. I've not been impressed with the type of turning tool that you see there, but I will confess that every now and again, rather than just using my pitchfork, I will fire up my Mantis or mini rototiller and go out and turn the compost pile that way. Also, that helps break the particles down a little bit too. Water, this is actually, I think, probably the most overlooked aspect of composting, because you put the stuff into the compost pile and you're kind of thinking, okay, I put my greens in, I put my browns in, everything should be going well. But if the ratio doesn't have enough water in it, and as it says here, it should be about 40 to 60%, or perhaps more qualitatively described as wet as a well squeezed out sponge. It should be moist to the touch. But if it's not, if it's too dry, the bacteria just aren't going to be happy and they're not going to do much work. So I frequently find that I have to add water to my compost pile just to keep the bacteria happy. If the pile gets too wet, if you end up with too much rain saturating your compost pile, you can either add browns, or the answer to almost everything is turn the pile. That will help it. But if it gets too wet, it can actually encourage the growth of anaerobic bacteria, which is something you definitely want to avoid from an odor aspect. So again, you make those browns and greens, you mix them, you turn it, you control that water content. And when the pile no longer heats, you allow it to cure for about 4 weeks, and that's when you have finished compost. But I think this photo really represents a good process from starting process on the left with the starting material. It's working in the center, you're turning it, and at the end you see that small amount that you're left with. That's your finished compost. I think that is an excellent example. Also, it's a good way of doing it, because then you get to move the pile from one stage to another to another. So when is the compost finished? It's going to be brown. It's not going to have any noticeable odor besides that earthy kind of smell. You shouldn't have much in the way of readily recognized feedstock. And again, the pile should be reduced in volume to roughly 1/3 of its original volume. So this is where my friend Bill would usually take over, but since he's retired from master gardening, this is where I'm going to continue. So now I've told you what you need to know to make the compost, but exactly how pragmatically can you go about it to make it happen, and what are you going to get out of it? So the first thing to consider is a container for your pile. Containers add the value of keeping the pile together. They promote the process, and generally speaking, they look better than just a pile. However, if you look in my backyard, this is what you will see. I've always lived in the country, and the idea of actually putting a container out there seems superfluous. So I just make a pile and it works just fine. But if I had neighbors nearby that were looking in my backyard, I think that I would actually get a container just because, as you can see, it's not particularly attractive looking. So if you're going to get a container, do you want to make it or buy it? Recognize that an ideal size for a home composter is roughly a 3 or 4 foot cube. It's sufficient in size to get all the compost decomposers working. It will retain sufficient heat to maintain the warm temperatures, and it's a manageable size. You can turn it without too much difficulty. Some examples of do-it-yourself compost bins, and I mentioned the Ag Center here in Berks County where we have the compost demo garden. We actually built our own compost corral made exclusively from waste pallets. We just screwed them together and they work absolutely fine. But you could use things like chicken wire, cinder blocks. This is my friend Bill's first attempt at composting. He used well, not exactly chicken wire, but wire for separating the piles. I will say one thing about using wires. It does give you a chance to use all your language skills if you are using a pitchfork to turn it, because invariably the pitchfork will hang up on one of the wires and will lead to some level of frustration. But there's almost an unlimited variety of do-it-yourself options. Anything from the cinder blocks in the top left to simple storage containers in the top right, to something that there's no way I could build in the bottom right because I have no construction skills. That looks like a pretty impressive. The one in bottom left is closer to what we did at the Ag Center. Or you may elect to buy a bin. There are all types of manufactured bins. You can get the ones that rotate, you can spin them. There are ones that are just stationary, you add from the top. If you're going to get a commercially available one, I kind of like the one in the lower right. It's just basically a extruded piece of plastic, and you can, it's designed to form a circle and you can screw it together, and it works well, gets some nice airflow going through. Snow fence would work similarly well if you want to do a little do-it-yourself. So if you're composting, and here's one of those extruded plastic bins that I was talking about. You can do a 2-barrel composting system where you simply put the 2 barrels next to one another with 3 spaces. And in Bill's case, he keeps it on its driveway to allow for good drainage. And what you'll see him doing is turning the compost. He simply lifts up one of the bins, moves its position to the spare spot, and then he can fork all the compost that's not finished into that new bin. And any of the compost at the bottom that is finished, he will take and use for whatever purpose he might want to use. So it's a really good system. We did use that at the Ag Center a bit. So it's not bad. So here again, you see him turning the compost, transferring it from one pile to the other, and harvesting the finished compost at the bottom. just repeat the process for the second bin. And as he mentions, the cleanup is easy, and that's always an important factor. If you need more compost, here's a community garden in downtown Reading where they ended up with, I think, about 10 different composting bins, and same thing. They move the compost from one to another but the idea is it allows you to relatively easily turn your compost for aeration and still use a container. So where should I put my compost pile? My first advice would be the last bullet, and that is be a good neighbor. Put it someplace where your neighbors can't see it, or at least that it's not a distraction to them. Going back to the top bullet, a shaded area will help prevent drying out in the summer. As I mentioned, moisture is a key element to the good composting. So that's a plus, but absolutely not necessary. At the Ag Center, again, it's sitting out in the middle of a demo garden area, so no shade whatsoever. If you're going to use kitchen scraps, you want it to be not too terribly far from your kitchen. Again, when I was a kid, it was just around the back of the house, probably 20 feet past the house. You want to have adequate work area around the pile. So again, leave yourself a little space. Don't put it tight up against the building. And as I've emphasized before, having it close to a water source is good. Makes it much easier to add moisture to the pile, and you're much more likely to do it if you've got the water source at hand. So what could possibly go wrong? In my working career, I was a safety manager, and that was the line that I used many, many times. What could possibly go wrong? And I discovered oftentimes there's a lot that could go wrong. Same is true of composting, but the good news is that composting is very forgiving. Probably the number one composting problem is odors. And you can get them easily. In fact, if I don't turn in my grass clippings the same day that I collect them, my wife will quickly point out to me that I haven't done it, because you'll get a noticeable odor within 24 hours of putting grass clippings onto the pile if you don't turn them in. Rotten odor, again, that's that rotten egg smell, means that you have anaerobic conditions, anaerobic bacteria at work. The things that anaerobic bacteria hate more than anything else is oxygen. So if you turn the pile, you will get oxygen in there, and you will make it easier for the smell to be dissipated. Again, if you have too much moisture or compaction, that can also lead to that rotten egg odor. Ammonia, that's why I mentioned when I put my grass clippings in and don't mix it in, the greens will lead to too much ammonia. So again, turn the pile, always the answer. Low temperature pile, if your temperature isn't going well, there's a couple things. You maybe just don't have enough volume to get and retain the heat. So you might need a slightly bigger pile. In the middle of winter, you're not really going to get a high temperature compost pile. But having said that, I checked my compost pile last, I think it was December 3rd that I checked it, and it was still going at about 110, 120 degrees. So until you're hitting really cold weather, your compost pile, if you're still adding the greens and the browns, they're going to keep going. Again, poor aeration. If you don't have enough aeration, the little bacteria in there simply aren't going to have enough oxygen to get going. Or you might not have had the right ratio. You may not have had enough greens. You maybe had too much brown. A simple solution for that is take a little urea and sprinkle that and turn that into the pile, because the urea, I think, is something like 50% nitrogen, and that will get your nitrogen in there. You can also make the pile bigger, add water, and turn the pile and add greens. High pile temperature, this happens very rarely, but it means that the bacteria are getting overworked. And again, the best thing you can do is simply turn the pile, because it will cool down the pile as you're turning it. You also can get those nuisance pests, the raccoons, the rats, and insects. So avoid the meat scraps that, and perhaps the egg shells. You can also use an animal-proof bin or even a wire mesh where you can keep the animals out. To be honest, I've not had any real serious problem with raccoons or rats or possums or anything like that. If I don't bury fresh kitchen scraps, though, it will attract flies, so just be aware of that. If you're putting a lot of fresh kitchen scraps into your piles, turn it in quickly. So why do we compost? Well, the first thing is to keep things out of the landfill, but also you want perhaps a little bit more payback than that. And the fact is that finished compost is fantastic. You know, we call it black gold, because if you can add it to your gardens, it just adds so much benefit to your gardens when you add compost. It's going to supply organic material, it will attract earthworms. It has some micronutrients that are excellent. It'll help the water holding capacity of your soil. It's just, you can't say enough good things about adding compost. And this slide, I think, is just an incredible slide, because at least here in Berks County, if you go out and you dig a fresh garden, you're digging in lots and lots of clay and growing in clay. So if you add compost, you're really going a long way to breaking down that clay and turning it into a loam, because that's ultimately what you want, is some form of loam. That's the best type soil for your garden. So again, the compost will loosen those heavy clay soils. It'll help with drainage, but yet it will also help retain moisture. So again, I can't see any response, but normally we would ask if you needed to fertilize if you compost, use compost in your gardens. And I get to give my favorite answer. It depends. Because compost adds a lot of benefit to the soil, but it's not strictly speaking a fertilizer. It contains lots of micronutrients, but it probably contains something on the order of 1% nitrogen. And you're probably all familiar with that NPK 10-10-10 type fertilizer. The compost is going to be more like 1-1-1. So it's not strictly speaking a fertilizer, even though it does contain a lot of micronutrients that will be beneficial. So the depends part is get a soil test from your local ag extension and test your soil. And that way you will know whether or not you need to fertilize. Compost versus mulch. So compost is actually a soil amendment that improves the soil. Mulch is just something you put on top of the soil to conserve moisture, minimize weeds, and improve visual appearance. The beauty is compost can be used as mulch and a lot of other things. So if you have enough compost, don't hesitate to use it as mulch. So as a soil amendment, you want that finished compost, make sure it's mature, has that earthy smell, crumbly, and you can mix it into the soil in the top 4 to 6 inches, or using it as mulch, you can add a 2-inch layer, and ultimately you end up with that loamy soil. Another kind of confession is I haven't grown potatoes in soil in probably 20 years because I've always had clay soil. So I actually just put my compost on top of the soil and kind of put the starter seed potatoes in there, and I grow grow potatoes in compost, and the compost makes it real nice to fill up the potatoes. And the only downside is it does dry out perhaps a little faster. But again, you want to reap those benefits of loamy soil. So you can put it in your perennial beds or around a tree. Again, never do the volcano. Don't get it tied up against the trunk and extend out to the drip line. So again, you're minimizing temperature extremes, you're controlling moisture, and the compost will provide a good slow release of nutrients. This is one I know that they say you can do, but I would never personally do, and that's lawn top dressing. You just, I tried it, I just couldn't get the compost fine enough that I thought that it looked half decent on the lawn. But if you've had your lawn aerated, then you might consider doing it because it certainly will improve the turf soil. You can also use it as part of a potting mixture. Again, you don't want to use pure compost, but it will work. And during the backyard composting season, you know, greens are easy to get, but browns are scarce, and then it sort of flips in the winter. So one option is to save your leaves. If you want to save your leaves, you can rake them onto a driveway, chew them up with your lawnmower. That way, if it's on the driveway, you won't get any greens mixed in, because if you did get the greens mixed in, you could inadvertently kick off the composting process. Pour the chopped up leaves into a trash bag and make sure you seal it up nicely so no moisture can get in. And if you have a good place to store it, you've got browns for the next season. I thank you for listening, and actually that's probably a good place to cut this off.
Thank you very much, Doug. Very nice presentation. We want to move to the Q&A session. Do you have some questions that have come up in the chat, Joe?
Yeah, there is one, Doug, and that question is, where did your friend get those plastic compost bins that he just dumps out to stir?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Sure. Where did your friend get those plastic compost bins that he just dumps out to stir? Any idea?
Honestly, I do not know.
No worries. Any other questions from the audience? That's the only one we've received in the chat so far.
Oh, there was one from Camilla in there. Let's see.
Oh, I see it now. Or actually, I see one from Tom. How do you feel about mulching grass clippings into the lawn versus collecting and creating compost?
Actually, I think just mulching it straight into the lawn is a great idea. I collect my lawn clippings simply because they're an easy source of greens, but if you have a mulching mower that works well, I think you're ahead of the game just to mulch it into the yard.
And is covering the pile a good idea?
I would say, well, I guess the first question would be cover it with what? If you're covering it to make it like watertight, I would say that that's not a good idea because you're also probably limiting the amount of air that will get in. So I would probably advise against it. If you're just putting a, again, if you have a container and you just want to put a top on it to seal it up against vermin and such, that's fine. But aside from keeping vermin out, I can't really think of a good reason to do that. And just one other aside, as I think of it, one thing that you may experience if you're composting is as you get towards finished compost, you'll be digging at the compost pile and you'll see these great big grubs. They're like an inch or two long and they're sort of disgusting looking. And, you know, my first instinct was, oh, I got to kill this. It must be bad. But it turns out that the grub is, I believe it's called a soldier fly, and they're very beneficial insects. So if you see a big grub in your compost pile, it's just, that's the one thing they like above all else is compost, and they're really a beneficial insect. So just gently put it back into the pile and let it be.
Phil, do you have Camille's question?
Hi, apparently I used too much wood ash and too much chicken manure for a while. Now my garden has a pH around 8. Now what?
Okay, probably the easiest solution is if you simply want to lower the pH of your garden is to get some elemental sulfur. I don't remember offhand what I'm sure there's a formula for how much sulfur you add. I know the pH scale is a logarithmic scale, but the elemental sulfur will definitely lower the pH for you, and that would probably be as inoffensive a way of lowering pH as any.
Okay, there's one more question. It's, do you till your garden to mix the compost with the soil or simply apply it to the top?
So in the example that I gave of growing the potatoes in the compost, I just put the compost on the top. But after I've harvested the potatoes, then I till the compost in. So the answer is yes, I do both.
And the next question is adding worms to the pile beneficial and worth the cost?
No, and actually that gets me to another point. If you go to like one of those big box stores, you will see compost starter, you know, on the shelves. Don't buy compost starter. Those microbes are going to make their way into your compost pile. Without that, you're kind of wasting your money. Similarly, the worms will show up in your compost pile. You don't need to go out and buy them. Now, if you're trying to do, I think it's called vermiculture, where you're actually raising the worms, that might be another story. But just for general composting purposes, I would never pay for worms, so they'll show up.
And how about adding cardboard for the browns?
Once again, cardboard would work. the issue with that is, getting it shredded sufficiently, but it will eventually break down. Newspapers are great. Maybe not the glossy pages. Those don't seem to break down as quickly, but cardboard would work, but it'd be a little bit more work, I think, just because of the fact that it's a little bit more dense, and I don't know how you could easily shred that.
Okay. Thank you. And is the elemental sulfur compatible with organic farming?
From the previous
I
question.
think it means, I think it's a type of compatible.
Yeah, I
compatible.
agree. Right. Yeah, I was trying to,
And
Yeah.
and that goes back to the earlier question about trying to resolve the pH.
Yeah, as far as whether or not it would be consistent with organic gardening, you'd have to, I'm not an organic gardener, even though I don't use pesticides, or for the most part, even fertilizers. But having said that, you'd really have to go to an organic gardening reference to determine whether or not elemental sulfur would be acceptable. Gut instinct is it should, because it's elemental sulfur. It's naturally occurring, but I think organic gardening might have some unique rules.
I use a revolving drum and get baseball-sized clumps. What's up with that?
I think the revolving drum is my least favorite composting bin. We had one for demonstration purposes at the demonstration garden, and it just rarely worked effectively. So I don't have a good answer for that, except to say that I don't like them personally, but I'm sure that if you follow all the rules that the manufacturer suggests, it probably will work. I guess I'm not a good rule follower.
Is it important to keep the leaves dry during the winter?
So if you're putting in the bags like the slide indicated, yes, you want to make sure that you seal those bags up well and don't let the leaves get wet, because otherwise you'll start having those anaerobic bacteria get to work, and when you open the bag in the spring, it will smell like rotten eggs in there. So yeah, don't let it get wet.
And is breaking them apart in the spring good enough? I'm not sure I understand that second part.
I'm guessing that it references if you don't chop them up, the leaves tend to layer, and that is a problem, because layer of leaves really does not compost very easily. That's one of the reasons I generally recommend that if you can, you run it through a lawnmower or a chipper shredder, and it'll compost a lot faster.
Okay, and there's a follow-up comment to that the leaves are shredded, but they get clumped up, and the person breaks them apart in the springtime.
Yep, that in that case, that's the perfect answer. Yeah, just break them up. Again, that's kind of goes to that same response about turning the pile. If you got anything that's clumped up, it's not going to decompose as quickly. Just turn it.
There was a comment on responding on the type of compost bin, apparently from Vida, that said that the one that we're looking at is the geo bin. About the earlier question of compost bin type that somebody had a question about?
Okay. So was there an additional question there, or just they were?
No, it's
identified?
just a comment I'm sharing with the group. Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, there's additional comment, I guess. I shred toilet paper and paper towel rolls. Wetting the rolls and cardboard first helps to shred the material easily. I find it a very zen experience to sit with the wet cardboard and shred it.
Phenomenal. I mean, that's anyone who has the patience and inclination to do that's wonderful, because that will compost then.
Any others from the audience? Any other questions, chat?
Or anybody would like to ask directly? You'd have to unmute your microphone.
It's a great time to get all those questions answered now that we're out and about in the garden. Looks like everybody's ready to roll.
Okay, great. Well, thank everyone for this. We'll hold the meeting open for a few minutes if anybody has any things that they would like to chat about, just in the general renewable energy and sustainable living realm. That's basically like a conference room at the end of a physical presentation where people are free to share ideas or ask questions or so on. We thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for this portion of the presentation, and we look forward to seeing you the last Tuesday of next month. That would be July, and where we'll be getting into the integrating renewable energy onto the grid. Thank you so much for joining us, and if you've got an electric car and want to talk about it, send us an email at hello@themarea.org, and we'd love to have you participate in the presentation for the August presentation.